get you on the podcast. I think we might have talked last, might have been in November at this point or something like that. But I'm really excited for our conversation today. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how about you start off with telling my audience, how you got into this IT space, right? So you're a journalist and you focus on cybersecurity. So I feel like that takes a very unique person, right? Because even for myself, right, I'm in cybersecurity and I probably wouldn't want to be a journalist on cybersecurity. How do I make this content, that's extremely complex? How do I make it consumable for everyone? That isn't something that I would want to go into, right? So what made you want to get into that area?
Yeah, well, I was a journalist. I'm no longer a journalist because I'm now with Intel 471, which
Hmm.
is a cyber threat intelligence company. But yeah, prior to joining them, I was a tech journalist focusing on cybersecurity starting around like 2005, and it really was just sort of I just sort of stumbled into it working for a trade technology publishing company, and I got a job with them, and they were sort of divvying up the beats. And somebody was doing sort of kind of cloud computing and infrastructure and chips and whatever, and they said, you're going to do security. And I'm like, sure, okay, knowing no idea anything about it at all, which is kind of like oddly how journalism kind of worked in those days. So that was the era of like the big worms, Microsoft's
Hmm.
trustworthy computing, right? The start of large scale, or like kind of like the start of organized cybercrime as well. So I don't come from a tech background, and so there was kind of a pretty steep learning curve. And as with you always learn more, right?
Yeah.
Continually. So there's just so much to learn in this industry. And so I did that, for a long time. And then one of my sources was Intel 471. And I was always interested in sort of that underground cybercrime, tracing personas and trying to figure out real world IDs. And, I did a
Hmm.
lot of chatting with threat actors as a journalist, because cyber criminals have to communicate one another, and they were always accessible through it was Jabber like 10 years ago or 12 years ago, and other ways before that. So it was always easy to reach them, and so that was always my interest. And so when Intel 471 said, you want to come work for us on our intel analysis team, I said, yeah, that sounds awesome. So now what I do a lot of like journalistic-y kind of things. um, I work with our analysis team, and also like our malware researchers and our analysts, who are in the forums, to basically look at ways like how can we talk about some of this intelligence that we collect, right? Because we're in all the forums, we're chatting with threat actors, selling proof of concept for, uh, you know, uh, the latest sort of vulnerability, and looking for ways to be able to talk about that publicly, because there's a lot of things that we can talk about. Actually, I should say that the other way. There's a lot of things we can't talk about, and finding the things that we can talk about, and that's because of our collection methods too, because we don't want to sacrifice, any of the access, that we have. Um, so yeah, basically looking for ways to publicize that. And I have a couple of podcasts on the side, and I work with our executives on kind of like thought leadership writing and things like that, and do a little bit of my own reading on the side. So that's
Hmm.
kind of in sum.
Yeah. When you were getting started, was there a source that was kind of like your go-to source? Maybe it'd be a person or a site or anything like that when you were trying to learn and just figure everything out?
I think, yeah. I mean, being a journalist, you have the benefit of being able to just call up and talk to most people. Computer security is kind of it's a different kind of beat, and I think it took me a long time to realize that, because, and particularly like in the CTI field, because a lot of researchers and people in the field, they don't want to have anything to do with the public, or like they don't want to be out there with their name.
Hmm.
Um, because and there's all kinds of reasons for that. You know, we saw the issues that Brian Krebs had with you know, threat actors linked to the com going back 10 years ago, right? When they were swatting him and sending, you know, some of the Russians, I think, were sending heroin to his house. And so, you know, there's always that risk of, I guess, harassment. Like, luckily, it never happened to me, but there's just a lot of people that, you know, and this goes to whole, you know, you work in security and like the whole issues around trust and sharing IOCs and sharing information about maybe specific things that TTPs that your organizations have been targeted for and weaknesses. And there's a real reluctance to be like, oh, I just want to share this out. And so it's taken a long time for like trust groups to build up and people to participate in ISACs and talk about this sort of stuff. But I think like as a journalist, like trying to cover this stuff, it did make it extra difficult. But I did find people that were more than happy to explain, like, can you explain BGP hijack to me? You know,
Mm.
or you know, whatever, things like that, like really technical things, or I guess really sophisticated kind of like DNS you know, issues and use of DNS by malware and things like that. There's always people out there that are happy to explain it. So I think you just have to, you know, kind of come to it from a really humble perspective. And even, you know, now, I mean, our you know, when like I'm gonna write a post about Android malware update that our analysis team found like last year. And so I'll be working really closely with them. You know, they'll read my stuff and I'll have more questions for them. And it kind of works in the same sort of way. Cause you have to think like even, you know, our our adversary analysis team are not necessarily malware analysis people. Like a lot of
Mm.
them have cross skills that apply, but you know, everybody's got their real like sweet lane and zone that they focus in, and you know, everybody's really cautious about speaking, you know, outside of their own lane.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. So tell me a little bit about Intel 471. I actually haven't heard of it before I started talking to you. So just give my audience, a little bit of background or something.
Sure. Yeah. So we were founded more than a decade ago by a couple of folks that came out of one was an Australian guy who hired me. He was a former AFP cybercrime technician. And another is an American guy who was a former FBI contractor who worked on a lot of investigations related to banking malware back in the early 2010s.
Hmm.
So, you know, our company is kind of, you know, we're a cyber threat intelligence company. So we collect intelligence. So we do a lot of underground forum scraping. We do a lot of engagements with threat actors. We write these really in depth reports about offerings on underground forums. We gauge the reputations of threat actors because that's really important. Because it's like somebody saying, "Hey, I compromised Joe South." You're like, "Well, who's this person, right? Do they have a history of reliable claims? Do they have a history of reliable sales?"
Hmm.
Um, we also do vulnerability intelligence, and so we look at new CVEs and look at in the underground because there's so many CVEs. So the problem is like, well, what's the ones we should focus on? Where should we focus our patching efforts? And we approach it from the perspective of like, okay, well, if underground actors are like, hey, have you got POC for that new, I don't know, Sonic Wall, you know, rumor of a Sonic Wall vulnerability, you know,
Hmm.
we'll look at that and go, oh, okay, so this person wants to buy this. They're a reputable buyer. This person says they're developing it. They're a reputable malware developer, you know, exploit developer. This is one you probably want to patch, right? Because this is what it looks like is coming down the pipeline. We've also recently got into threat hunting. We acquired a company called Cybersecurity, and so they make a threat hunting platform, um, which is basically hunting, you know, in your SIMs, in your EDR systems and Sysmon, your logging systems for those clues that you might have been infected by something. So, say you've got like you don't use PS exec, right? Like the remote management tool in your organization, and suddenly you've done a threat hunt for PS exec and you found it like
Hmm.
in your sim. And you can go, oh, right, we don't run that. This is definitely something we should probably look at. And that's really tying into our whole malware intelligence too, which I spoke a little bit about our malware intel team. And so, you know, we emulate more than sort of like 300 malware families. We collect samples directly from threat actors and also, public repositories, extract indicators from those. So those could be like C2 addresses, other artifacts related to those malware families. And, we write reports about those, engage their, from a threat. We put a monthly malware report out basically to say, oh, okay, this month we've seen thousands of downloads of smoke loader as a payload, one of the loaders, or we've seen 5,000 downloads of redline, right, and info stealer. So we can track all those malware families really granularly, and that kind of feeds into threat hunting. So when we see like a big malware campaign go out, say with redline, we can take those artifacts and those indicators and then write detections for them in our threat hunting module. So you'll have packages that go, basically our analysts they write the queries. Like the tough part of threat hunting is writing the queries,
Hmm.
right? So say you use CrowdStrike EDR. So we have like copy paste queries that we can go, okay, I want to go and look for an abnormal process that's been launched or process service launched from an odd location, right? Typical sign of malware used by heaps of malware families. So you could just copy that query, plunk it into, like CrowdStrike, and then search those logs for that activity. Requires a bit of tweaking, right? Like nothing's like perfect. But yeah, that's the way we, in a nutshell. I've probably spoken too much, but what we do.
Oh no, you're totally fine. Yeah, maybe a year ago, maybe more at this point, I had on Chris Rock, who not the comedian, right? Um, but he described himself as like a cyber mercenary, right? Where he's kind of like out, on some forums, and he's hireable for various things, right? And it was an interesting conversation for sure, and it was maybe the only conversation that I've ever had with someone that I felt like I should probably not have the conversation, because of the things that he was talking about that he did and everything. It was like, man, I really don't want the FBI like showing up at my door, like this is one of those conversations where it probably would.
Oh,
um
right. Yeah, yeah. There's a variance of practices in CTI. We have, we have a strict sort of ethical code that we use for our operations, just to, specifically ensure that obviously we don't want to violate, any sort of, computer security, fraud and abuse laws or anything like that. So, this field, there's a variety of practitioners who have a variety of methods. Some are more aggressive as well. Like, if you're logging into systems, right, you could get more intelligence, right? That's also a possibility. I mean, we've seen that happen with like law enforcement is doing that now, in the ransomware fight, right? Like they're able to compromise,
right.
they compromise Lockbit systems, and that's something that we would not do, right? Because that's not in our purview, and it's not legal for us to do. But yeah, that's so sometimes when you see some incredible intelligence, like we've got the entire list of Lockbit affiliates, right, and their nicks, right, and that's what law enforcement released with Lockbit, which is great stuff, and they're authorized to do it, and that helps, in the fight. But yeah, like I said, there's just a range of things. We work very closely with law enforcement, as do many other CTI companies, because everybody's got like a little slice of the picture
Hmm.
too. So occasionally we'll be listed, as helping with investigations into some of these, really complex law enforcement operations that have been
Hmm.
happening, over the last couple of years.
Hmm. Well, okay, so now I have two questions, right? So, have you actually come across other cyber mercenaries to some extent that are kind of for hire? Because I feel like that just that whole place, that whole like marketplace, right, so to speak, is so I don't know, shady. Like I would not want to be I would not want to be anywhere near that Tor browser, or that Onion router. when you're trying to do that. Like, have you talked to some people that are in that area and discussed like what they were doing and whatnot?
Well, not really. What are they doing? I guess I would ask the question to you.
Yeah, I mean, he talked about gaining footholds in enemy governments, electrical grids, and jamming the what is it? It's the IED blockers back when, early 2000s when America was in Afghanistan and Iraq, and, IEDs were a huge problem. Well, the NSA came up with something that would jam all of the IEDs in the vicinity. This guy came up with a solution for Al Qaeda to override that jam and still get through to the IEDs, right? So, talking about stuff like that, where it's like bad organizations typically are
Yeah,
going on
yeah.
these forums, hiring people.
Yeah, I think I've read actually, I think I recently read of somebody like that, of kind of I don't know if lone wolf is the right term for it. I mean, I think there are people out there that will insert themselves into situations, but I would caution that that's, you know, the whole thing is like with law enforcement actions and things like that is that if you have people coming from the outside thinking that they're doing good, they
Hmm.
could do harm, right?
Yeah.
Because most likely whatever target that they've decided to focus on may already be involved, the target of a a formal investigation. So the risk of those people going in there and maybe tampering with potential evidence is really high. So I think that you know everybody would probably encourage, like, right, it's good that you're involved in this and worried about this, but maybe hold your fire to figure out kind of what's going on, right?
Hmm.
Or send a tip to your your local cert or law enforcement, about it, right? Because I think that it is a team fight, right? But it's also like, we you don't want friendly fire either,
Right.
to kind of meddle with something. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would my first instinct would be like just kind of caution, like admire the enthusiasm, but just be aware that there already might be something going on, and that your your hacking might cause a bit of issue.
Right. Yeah. It's just it's a really dicey it's a dicey situation that I found myself in at one time with that interview where it's just like, man, I don't know if I should be talking to this guy right now. Like, you know, it's like we might end this thing a little bit early, but I mean, it was a
Right.
great conversation overall, but it's just like a crazy experience that, going into running a podcast you'd never think about, right? Like, because why would someone in that area ever want to talk to me but publicly? I recorded his video, his face, like it's like I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
I don't know, but he did seem very legit, and other, you know, halfway shady people have like vouched for him to me. So I was like, this seems too real. What are you talked about potentially like assisting law enforcement to some extent with like highly complex, cases or situations and whatnot. Can you tell me about, some of those situations? Is there any, cyber criminal uh, actions or articles or anything that are public knowledge that you may have assisted with or your company may have assisted with?
We've definitely been acknowledged by certain agencies before for providing intelligence. Like, we're an intelligence provider too, so
Mhm.
we have law enforcement customers as well. And so if they would come to us and want more information about something, we would certainly provide it. I mean, I think you'll see like a lot of these large law enforcement actions. There's a huge list of agencies. They'll often acknowledge private companies that have helped as well. And like I said, it's just because everybody has a little bit more of a piece, right? And there's just a lot of threads to pull in cybercrime. So some organizations may have more data on certain groups or specific threat actors, or specific malware campaigns than others.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's all big one, and I think like honestly, from compared to maybe a decade ago, or even more, there's like a lot just more coordination now than there used to be. And the adversaries were always able to exploit this really slow gap in between when a threat was identified, or a group was identified, and when something could actually happen. Now granted, like this is never going to be super fast anyway, because cybercrime moves so fast, right?
Hmm.
And their adaptability can far outpace um, formal organizations to be able to react. But I mean, just like the breach activity that we see day by day is just, it's off the scale. Like, and I think
Yeah.
like the scale of it right now is like really large, so it kind of forces investigators to go after kind of like the biggest sort of operations things too. And there's been pinch points that have been identified, right? In the last year, we've seen them go after ransomware groups. We've seen them go after malware infrastructure that's used to gain initial access to computers and then monetize that access. um, we've seen them shut down forums that have, like the Genesis market that was selling credentials, or basically cookies, whole batches of data from compromised computers. We've seen them go after like the cryptocurrency mixers, right? That's been a whole thing too, and also shut down cryptocurrency exchanges. So there's clear like choke points um to focus on, and we're seeing that it's working in a way,
Hmm.
right? The latest ransomware payment numbers were, or I guess the amount of money paid in ransoms last year, according to Chainalysis, was like, I think it was a third less than
Oh wow.
2023. It was, yeah. So like, how do you attribute that impact? Well, probably a bit of law enforcement, a bit of disruption, maybe difficulty. And there definitely were difficulties in cashing out too, because Chainalysis said like a lot of funds are just sitting in addresses like
Yeah.
now, and not they're not moving it at all because it's been flagged. Right now we've got all these great blockchain companies that are flagging transactions. So we're seeing, I mean, you know it's hopefully this is meaningful reductions and it's not going to bounce back up. I mean, I like to see like a couple of years, like 2 or 3 years of numbers going trending down before you go, oh, okay, now we can go back in retrospect and analyze, okay, well, what caused this, right? Is this just like seasonal, or just some yearly flux, or like war in Ukraine in 2022 caused a big disruption? Is this because of sort of geopolitical events too?
Hmm.
So it takes a while to go, oh, okay, like this is really working. But I think it's on the right track.
Hmm. That's really that's fascinating that it went down by a third. That's not a small number. I mean, a company's revenue drops by a third, and they're laying off a third of their workforce. Like
Yeah.
that's a substantial drop. And I remember reading an article, a couple months ago about how hackers are going back to, like social engineering and more basic attacks that were more prevalent in like the 80s and 90s, really, because companies have like kind of awoken to like cybersecurity and the importance of it and whatnot. And like this is something that you can't ignore, and if you do ignore it, you're going to pay quite literally a lot of money, and your brand reputation is damaged forever. I mean, who doesn't know about the Target breach, right? And that happened almost 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago at this point.
Oh yeah, yeah,
But who
yeah,
doesn't
right.
know about it, right? Who doesn't
Hmm.
know that Target was breached?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, th- if you talk about well, to go back to the ransomware thing, like it dropped by a third. I was still a bit kind of cold on it in a
Hmm.
way, because it still amounted to $800 million in ransoms paid. And I guess 2 points on that. One, it's always an underestimate because there's just
Right.
stuff because of the way that we track or try to track ransomware that just escapes scrutiny. $800 million for a cybercrime enterprise is still pretty good.
Yeah.
And the other part of it that I thought was not great was that the attack numbers were just barely less. Like I think maybe less than 5% down.
Hmm.
So you've got fewer organizations apparently paying because better cyber resiliency. That's terrific. But you have the same number of attacks. And you have to think like, okay, well, even if you don't pay a ransom, because that's one component of the cost of a ransomware attack, if you were attacked by a ransomware group and you are breached, there's still an enormous amount of cost associated with that, right? In like disclosure and legal fees
Yeah.
and you might have cyber insurance but it might not cover all of it. So to capture the full cost, or to go, all right, is this a real reduction in the threat landscape? And I would argue not really, right? It's better that less people paying cyber criminals means that in theory there's less incentive to do more cybercrime, right? The more frustrated that they get, right, like the lower the hit rate, the less likely they're going to be like, oh, this is getting hard. Maybe we'll move on to something else,
Yeah.
and that's good. But it's not the full picture, I think, of what we're seeing with ransomware. So I'm really reluctant to be like, we've turned the corner on this. I think these are
Hmm.
preliminary, really positive numbers. But I would say for enterprises going, oh, okay, we can just kind of maybe take the foot off the gas in our resiliency plans or,
Hmm.
hardening or anything like that. I would say absolutely not. You've got to really be aware of these common vectors that ransomware groups are gaining access. So
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's interesting. Kind of that backstory, like behind the numbers, right? Because if you look at it at face value, I mean, that's the headline right there, right? Ransomware payouts decreased by a third. You think, okay, like we're doing something positive. Like we've made a huge turn here. Ransomware isn't even going to be an industry in a couple of years, then, right? Like that's the kind of mind jumps that you can take with a title like that, and then you dig in,
yeah,
and it's like,
yeah.
not quite, right? Not exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason why ransomware took off too is like, 2015, it was basically like banking malware got really hard. Like the
Hmm.
banks got a lot better at stopping transactions to money mules and those transfers, right? And so then when kind of ransomware came back because, the proof of concept was like in the 80s, it was kind of like, hey, this is easy and this is big money, right? So rather than trying to like steal 150 grand and split it six ways into six different accounts and right, and the and that got shut down, it's like, oh, I could get $200,000 from a single organization like that,
Yeah.
using crypto. I don't have to use the banking system. So I would argue that even if the amounts paid by infected, or if an organization decides to pay a ransom, and even if it is a small amount, like quote unquote small, $200,000, that's still a good pop, right? For somebody
Yeah.
who's just working to for a ransomware group, because it's arguably easier than going back to the banking malware stuff. Now this stuff is always evolving. But I think at the point, like, maybe we'll see a shift where it's just really hard to get a payout, when you have people that are working really, really, really hard to get, and it also, I think if it becomes unfeasible to really run a ransomware as a service group, kind of like the whole like, hey, we developed the malware in the back end, and the whole affiliate model, when that kind of gets busted up too, when it gets too risky to do that. What we saw in the last year was a lot of when Alpha V went down, like Hive went down and Lockbit went down, we saw a lot of like new ransomware brands kind of pop up from like smaller groups that
Hmm.
some of them look like they were maybe started by threat actors that came out of like Conti and Ryuk, like kind of long running actors. And but these smaller operations, right, it makes ransomware harder to track. But our theory and a lot of other groups' theory was that, well, maybe they're doing this because they don't, they don't want to get exposed in like the big lockpick bust, right, where the back end of Lockbit is revealing, perhaps data
Hmm.
about them, that can be used to track them. So we'll split into smaller groups and do smaller jobs. So I think that's what we could be seeing going ahead. It just kind of makes sense to us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So to kind of switch gears a little bit, right? Pique my own curiosity here, right? W- What have you seen with nation state actors and maybe even the inner workings between them and different, hacker groups that may not even be associated with that nation state actor? I'm thinking of things like, obviously Iran and Russia and whatnot. Um, and I'm also very interested to see or hear if you guys saw anything coming before the Russia invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Like, did you see any intel indicating, hey, this thing may actually happen, right?
Oh, with that, only in open source, right? I
Mhm.
mean, I think that caught a lot of people off. Caught a lot of there was a lot of collaboration between Ukrainian threat actors and Russian threat actors. But the war caused a big sort of split. But I mean, prior to that, just open source that everybody else sort of saw. But as far as nation state, I mean, we've seen this increasing intersection of cybercrime and nation state stuff, and then
Hmm.
it's been happening for a few different reasons, and depending on like the threat actor, right? So we've seen a lot of like double dipping in the sense that we'll see like threat actors in like China or Iran, right? Like oftentimes like the nation state stuff gets mixed up into like private companies, as it does in the West too, where you have private companies offering services to nation states for for their operations. And sometimes you see some of those actors kind of double dipping. I know we saw this with some China actors as well, where it kind of looked like they were doing sort of two sorts of jobs, like
Hmm.
some kind of side jobs of like financially motivated things, and then the formal job. And with Russian threat actors, I mean, we've seen the Russian state lean on threat actors for a long time, right,
Yeah.
for their own sort of purposes. So we know, like going back to like Game Over Zeus, TrickBot, and this is public knowledge too. This is not stuff that you can't research, but there's been
Right.
sanctions levied against the TrickBot actors,
Hmm.
where the U.S. government has openly said, and I think the U.K. government, that there's there's affiliations with um, Russian intelligence. And it kind of makes sense too that like when you have very sophisticated threat actors running botnets that have access to millions of people's computers, that could aid in their operations as well.
Right.
So I'll give you another example of that too, right? So we saw a threat actor, and I'm trying to remember the acronym. I think this person went by FXMSP, and so this person was an initial access broker, and this was probably like 5 to 7 years ago. And this person was selling access or access credentials for SolarWinds.
Huh.
So, and then when you look at what happened, now to be clear, like we were never able to. I don't think we were able to specifically connect this sale of these access credentials uh, to like Russian intelligence group, Russian intelligence in the group that later breached SolarWinds and caused one of the biggest,
Right.
supply chain attacks on record. However, there definitely is, right. There's this whole marketplace, because I think FXM SP like took those credentials off like pretty quickly, too,
Hmm.
indicating that they were sold. And that's typically what happens when credentials are sold. Is like there's an offering. Sometimes they're not too specific about what organization that they've got access or credentials to or cookies for. And we can like try to guess or engage the actor or sort of figure it out in the other way. But I mean, that's the type of thing that like other threat actors and ransomware actors like look for, is like, oh, okay, you've got credentials for this particular organization, that's a good one that might pay a ransom.
Hmm.
So anyway, we saw these credentials withdrawn, and then we're like, oh, that's really interesting that the SolarWinds breach, like this happened, and then the SolarWinds breach could have happened another way. We don't know, but we know like a lot of organizations are breached because they've been phished. Um, you mentioned social engineering. I mean, that's another way that kind of also sometimes works with phishing as well, to get in. But there's like this, to get back to the whole interplay between government and APTs, like or government and financially motivated cybercrime. There are definitely overlaps that we see sometimes in infrastructure as well,
Hmm.
and actors going, "Oh, okay, well, this definitely looks like this person's doing like these people are doing like a couple different things." Right.
Yeah.
So
That's fascinating that they're almost like moonlighting. You know, it's like, man, I was talking to someone that is a cyber warfare officer for the U.S. military, right? And he he talked about like actually, getting target packages, developing the executable, and creating the documentation for the next guy to go and execute, the attack with his payload and everything, right? And he was talking to me about it, and I'm just sitting here thinking, like, man, I really hope this guy never goes rogue, because like what he's talking about right now, it's unstoppable, right? Like I asked him, has there ever been a target package that you were handed that you just couldn't get into, you just couldn't find a way in, right? And he said, no, there's never been a single thing. He goes, sometimes if it's really hard, I'll go and I'll hack the phone sometimes, and I'll go from the phone and I'll leap onto their laptop, and when I'm on their laptop, it's game over, right? And he's like, and think about it. If I have their phone, I have their MFA, right? If I have their MFA, there's nothing that's going to stop me when they enter that building.
yep.
And I mean, it was really interesting. I actually haven't released that episode yet. I'm probably going to release it sometime this year. I actually recorded it, I think, 4 years ago at this point. Because this guy, he completely disappeared. He used a totally different alias. I didn't record the video. I only had audio at that time, and I mean he's been scrubbed off the internet, right? So I know there was something to it, because this guy is non-existent.
Spooky stuff. That raises a really good point, and it was something that I saw. It came up on the Risky Business podcast. That they were quoting a report from CyberCX, which is a big Australian consultancy down here, and it was basically their annual report divided their investigations according to sort of adversary, right? So this was really interesting. Like 5% was like espionage, so that's
Hmm.
like kind of APT. 60, I think 60 something, 67% was financially motivated cybercrime. I think there was a third, a large, like 27% was just kind of undetermined. But I just heard the other day that CISOs and CSOs are often worried about APTs,
Yeah.
right? And as well, look, depending on your sector, if you're CNI, critical national infrastructure, I mean, undeniably, if you're like a telco or ISP, for sure. But I mean, I kind of agree with Selena Larson of Proofpoint, who for a few years has been talking about how if you're hyper focused on trying to stop an APT, you're probably missing the more likely source of an
Right.
attack, which is financially motivated threat actors. And, um, you know, and as you say, your source that you spoke with of, right, if an APT is determined to get into your organization, I mean, I would argue good luck stopping them.
Yeah.
Not to say you shouldn't try, right? But yeah, right? Like, you know, it's going to be really, really difficult if either China or Iran or Russia's top tier group of cyber sig intel people
Right.
decide we're going to get into you, right? Who
Yeah.
have infinite amount of time, who have an infinite amount of resources, who are not looking to monetize quickly, right? Because I guess that's one thing that separates a huge thing that separates APT from fin crime, right? And this was also in that same report. Like the dwell time for APT, 400 days, right? They're not
Hmm.
looking to make a buck. They're looking to for long-term access to be exploited down the road.
Right.
Fin crime needs to get paid, right? They've paid for access credentials, they're paid for bulletproof hosting, they've got to pay for their fish kits, they got to pay for a bunch of,
Yeah.
they've got to pay for a bunch of stuff, right? So they want to get a payout, right? And I think that dwell time was like, matter of days now. So, not to say, I'm not saying like APT is not important by any means, like for national security. Um, it's hugely, hugely important. But I would say, like, if you are a private company, like, right, and you have limited resources, probably studying Cozy Bear's techniques and ensuring you're perfectly guarded against those. The latest threat report that's come out, DFIR report that's come out against Cozy Bear is probably not the best use of your resources. Um, it's probably the fin crime folks that are going to cause you the biggest and most public headache.
Yeah.
Because if you look at like, right, what does fin crime do? They steal your data and they put it on breach forums, or they steal your data and put it on a ransomware. Like it's a huge amount of hassle straight away, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like public, it's like they're trying to extort you and they're threatening you and it's really aggressive. They're WhatsApping your, CEO and harassing his wife or her wife. um it's just like a big intense thing while your APT espionage people are kind of like slinking in slowly, you're trying to slink out slowly. So different, it just depends on your threat. It comes back to threat modeling, right? Like who is most likely to attack you? How do you defend against that, right?
Hmm.
It's good to also not to just don't overcomplicate it, right?
Right.
You have the added benefit that like a lot of fin crime groups and APTs are now using the same techniques, right? So if you're doing like, especially I see this in our threat hunt platform, right? Like we'll look at a specific technique. Um, like say we'll take DNS request from an application like that you didn't install, like an unorthodox DNS request, right? And you look at like the techniques or the groups that will use that, and it could be like
Hmm.
APT, it could be FinCrime, right? So some of the stuff is cross applies, which I guess is good from a time perspective. But again, it's just like realizing, okay, who's most likely to attack us, and do we have those vectors covered as best
Right.
as possible?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, right? It's extremely important to understand even who your adversary is, right? Like you have to understand who's actually coming for you. Who wants access to your computer and whatnot. I talked to an AI security researcher at NVIDIA, right? And he
Wow.
was talking about the security protocols that they put up for their chips, for all of their chips, all of their products, right? And he said that the only thing that's even comparable is when like you go to like a government facility and you have to go into a skiv, right? And uh just to have a conversation about a certain topic, because the security at their facility is so top notch that the government goes to see what they're doing so that they can replicate it in their environments, right? And that's a unique use case, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, how much would China spend just to get, the blueprints for the next Nvidia chip, just so that
Yeah.
they could create it quicker than Nvidia and come out with it and increase their AI power, right? Like, I mean, that's something where it's just like, hey, just get it done. Don't worry about the money, right? Like, don't even
Yeah.
like don't even worry about
Yeah.
the check. You don't have to fill it out. I'll fill out the check at the end, like that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And that works for 1% of the world's companies and entities out there, right? But like for everyone else, it's like, hey, let's cover our bases first, and if we got some money to blow, then we'll talk about some other stuff with that's more advanced. But as of right now, we're too soft of a target to even be worried about APTs.
Yeah. Look, good security slows everything down. So if you look at the protocols that are in place for handling like classified information within the US government,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's skiffs. It's, drop your electronic device at the door. It's, it's
Oh man.
designed to slow everything down, right? And to make it as hard as possible. So good security slows everything down. That's the antithesis to business, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, NVIDIA, right, has decided and has made that choice that this is our most valuable intellectual property. And we're going to take every step, no matter how inconvenient, right? Uh, you know, uh,
It might
to
be the
be
most
able to
valuable
protect it.
IP on the planet.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
might be.
it definitely could be. So yeah, so like, look, you can always implement better security, and I guess that's always the trade off with business processes of like, okay, well, what do we need to protect, and how secure does it need to be, and how much is that a disruption to what we need to do, as a business every single day? And those are choices that CISOs and CSOs have to make, all the time. Where you've got probably analysts, going, we really need to do we really need to do like phishing resistant, right? Here's an example: phishing resistant, FIDO keys, basically. So you have to stick it in your computer before you log in, right? Like this is the best way to basically stop credential theft
Hmm.
now, because phishing kits and info stealers are basically grabbing credentials, grabbing cookies, grabbing everything off the machine. And if you have the cookie,
You got
MFA is
everything you need.
irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like unless that cookie expires, you can set like short expiration dates. But anyway, like, and like the thing is of like having to have something with you and insert in a machine is a pain, right?
Yeah.
Like that's something else that people might forget, or but that's the point that we're at. And so, if you want it to be the most secure that it can be, and I would argue that protecting credential theft and cookie theft should be number one, because that's one of the primary ways that adversaries get access to machines. So yeah, I think for better security, we're going to have to put up with some inconvenience, or just a change in work processes and patterns, and that's where we're at. If that's what we have to do to protect data,
Right.
then that's what we have to do. So I mean, remember, like, even a few years ago, like there'd be a breach and like companies would be like, oh, we don't want to reset everyone's password because that would inconvenience people. And you're like, now that's just kind of like, what? It's a joke. It's
Yeah.
laughable, right? We're laughing at it. Like, of course you have to reset everybody's password if your password database has been stolen, or
Right.
or whatever. So yeah, we just had to change our mindsets too, and be like, things that are inconvenient at first glance often just become routine, right? Like,
Right.
it's like, oh, okay, there's been break-ins in our neighborhood, maybe I should do the second lock or whatever, or just like the things that we modify in our own personal lives because we perceive an increased threat risk. Like, okay, I'm going to really wash my hands because people have got the flu, right? It's inconvenient, it takes longer to wash your hands 3 more times a day or whatever, but it probably lowers your risk arguably of getting the flu. So
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, we've been on this thing for a while now, right? Like the conversation really flew by, at least for me, right? And I'm very conscious of everyone's time, but I want to ask you one more question. Where do you where do you think security is going in 2025? What are some trends that you're seeing, potentially, security trends, as in organizations potentially deploying more controls on a certain area, or, areas that are being attacked more in 2025 that you can foresee?
well, am I allowed to talk about AI and DeepSeek?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we go for another hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think organizations are going to be just increasingly challenged by like sort of deep fakes and things like that as well, and that's things that AI is like really good at. We won't get into the whole like malware development and things like that, but I think like social engineering, AI is going to really has really been sort of boosting that, audio deep fakes, things like that are very tangible right now. And I think I guess again with like the major sort of threat actors, I would say ransomware too. And it's like again, just kind of like don't sort of overthink it. Move to phishing resistant authentication. Like that's a huge one. Like, just patching stuff on CIS's Kev, right? The known
Yeah.
exploited vulnerabilities list, right? Kev's is a dead simple thing. They just took the vulnerabilities if they're exploited and put them on a list. Dead simple, right? We don't have to overcomplicate it, and those are the ones you should patch straight away, right? Um, Simple things like that. I mean, I think organizations get caught off guard too by you know uh, social engineering is very powerful, especially for very large organizations like telcos that have lots of customer service reps. We've seen that with like SIM swapping and things of that nature too. So, but and misconfigurations as well, right? And just knowing your attack surface, right? What services are exposed to the internet? I mean, again, dead simple. Attackers go to Census and Shodan and look for what internet facing assets you have and compare that to, is there exploit code for it? Can I attack it? So like securing edge devices and taking RDP, like knowing all, if you've got exposed RDP ports, all this like really kind of basic stuff that people have been talking about for years is still extremely relevant. So I mean, I would say that's the biggest thing, like know your attack surface, know what's facing outwardly, because that's the first stuff when attackers are going like, okay, I'm going to enumerate subdomains and figure out the one that they've forgotten or whatever, all the just the usual basic
Yeah.
stuff that still gets a lot of mileage. So I mean, hopefully that's a concise answer to your question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's like as concise as you can be, right? Like, especially with those topics. I mean, but that just means that I'm gonna have to have you back on for a part two or something like that. Maybe a little bit of like a regular or a biannual episode with you.
I'd love it. It'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was fantastic having you on. Before I let you go, how about you tell my audience, where they can find you, where they can find, any other resources from Intel 471 that you want to direct people to?
Yeah, totally. So the signal to noise, or rather the noise to signal ratio on X, aka Twitter these days, is just too high for me. So I've gone to Blue Sky, which is actually developing a nice sort of infosec
Hmm.
kind of community there. I'm on Mastodon as well, and LinkedIn. Our blog puts out a lot of research from Intel 471 on malware and threat actors and DeepSeek. We've also got some great threat hunting content too. That's pretty hot right now. Organizations are looking to like get ahead of their if they're infected, like assume you get infected and you want to get rid of it, you conduct threat hunts. So that's a whole new area that I'm very much learning about too, which is cool. So yeah, I'd say, and also I write a newsletter that comes out on Tuesdays
Hmm.
called the Executive Intelligence Update. It's actually aimed at just sort of security CTI practitioners, and it's basically like 4 items to kind of like, sometimes big picture, sometimes strategic, sometimes a lot of strategic stuff, sometimes tactical and even operational stuff. Like I'll write some about some malware campaigns that our malware team has been working on. But it's like a good summary of sort of infosec news. I know there's heaps of stuff out there to read and consume, but it's relatively short and it gets to the point. So I'd encourage people to sign up for that as well.
Hmm. Awesome. I'm gonna have to sign up for it myself. That'll be great.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jeremy. I really do appreciate you coming on, and I hope everyone out there enjoyed listening or watching on whatever platform you're on. Thanks, everyone. Cool. That was a great episode.
Awesome. Did you do that one live, or is that
I did. I'm sorry.